Welcome back to Catholic Wisdom, where the wisdom is not mine, it's the wisdom of the Christian tradition. The story of too many YouTube content creators like me is basically a modern retelling of the myth of Narcissus. So, with this Catholic channel of mine, I really want to be careful about not exalting my own self. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Matthew 23:12. And with all this out of the way, today I'd like to talk to you about Nefarious. Nefarious is an independent horror film written and directed by Chuck Konzelman and Cary Solomon, based on a novel by Steve Deace. The movie stars Jordan Belfi as a psychiatrist who must determine if a convicted death row inmate, played by Sean Patrick Flannery, is faking his alleged demonic possession. No worries, I'm not going to spoil anything about the plot. I'm just going to touch on the main premise, something that you can see in the first 5 minutes of the movie.
Execution scheduled for 11 p.m. He's trying to convince us he's gone insane.
And therefore incapable of being executed.
I need you to prove he's faking it.
Edward, let me ask you some questions.
I'm not Edward. I'm a demon.
Demons aren't really a thing.
This psychologist arrives at a state prison, to interrogate this serial killer, and he's also a death row inmate called Edward. Before meeting Edward, the psychologist reveals to the warden that he was brought in to fill in for Dr. Stewart. Dr. Stewart was his predecessor, and he was Edward's regular visitor for this procedure. Dr. Stewart, however, has committed suicide the night before, causing Martin to replace him. So Edward is scheduled to die on the electric chair at his own insistence that very day, the very night, at 11 p.m. And the warden explains to the psychologist that Edward's fate depends on his diagnosis. If Martin, the psychologist, deduces that Edward is sane, then he will be executed. But if Martin declares him insane with multiple personality disorder, as the previous doctor had believed, then Edward will be spared. This is the entire premise, and we understand this in the very first 4 or 5 minutes of the movie. Now, the big question is, and that I've seen in the reviews as well, is this really a horror movie or is this not a horror movie? There is no doubt in my mind that this is a horror movie. It's just a matter of what do we define by horror? Because we are so used to Hollywood horror being always about gore and blood and violence and scares that we think that horror is just that. But many movies, for example, by Hitchcock, were considered horror movies as well, and there was no violence, no gore, and no blood. So, like in this particular case, the horror is much more psychological. I would say this would very well fit into the definition of a Christian spiritual movie, but at the same time, a psychological thriller. And when I say Christian, it doesn't mean that we are presented with characters who are faithful or Christians. In fact, no characters at all in the entire story, in the entire plot, are faithful Christians. Only one of these characters will be maybe slightly preaching, but is not the character that you would expect to be preaching. So, right after introductions, Edward, the inmate, gives the psychologist a terrible warning. He says, before you leave here tonight, you will have killed 3 people. Oh, and by the way, he adds, he's not really Edward. He's a demon named Nefarious. And so we have this situation where the psychologist is trying to understand, am I in front of somebody who is insane or am I in front of somebody who is trying to play me? And he doesn't even seem to consider that there might be a third option here. If you're familiar with C.S. Lewis and in particular his Screwtape Letters, you will understand why many reviewers have referenced the Screwtape Letters when talking about this movie. As I said, there is not one character in the film that identifies as Christian or has having any faith at all, aside from maybe one particular priest who's very ineffectual, by the way. In fact, just about the only guy here who seems to actually believe in God is the villain of the movie. And that's why many reviewers went back to C.S. Lewis and the Screwtape Letters. Personally, I enjoyed the movie very much. The dialogue is very snappy. It keeps you trying to guess, and it keeps you very attentive to especially the back and forth between the psychologist and this inmate. Now, there is a small part towards the end that, in my opinion, is a little bit ill-advised, to say the least, because the rhythm of the movie comes to almost, it goes so well for at least 3/4 of it, and then for the last final bit, it comes to almost a halt when we have this epilogue featuring, of all people, former Fox News host Glenn Beck. And that is, not only in my opinion, but in many other reviewers' opinion, a near-fatal error, because every American viewer recognizes Glenn Beck's face, and not only the fourth wall is completely shattered, but also, more tragically, I would say, at least half of the viewers will be rolling their eyes as soon as they see him. It gives the movie a political seal that, in my opinion, was not necessary, especially because Christian values, if the movie wants to purport Christian values and show Christian values, they don't belong to any political side. And on this point, since the movie talks about demonic possession and talks about evil very much, it really reminds me of Romans 16:17, where he says, "I urge you, brothers and sisters, to watch out for those who cause divisions and put obstacles in your way that are contrary to the teaching you have learned. Keep away from them." As you probably have understood so far, this is not a Hollywood movie. In fact, I would call it an anti-Hollywood movie. One of those rare gems that really push back against mainstream culture and mainstream Hollywood values that we all know what they are. So on one hand, even if the production is very, very good, you can see that this movie belongs more in the B segment of the movie. So you can call it a B movie, at least from a production standpoint, even though the actors are doing a phenomenal job, for sure, and the directors as well. However, on the other, it wouldn't surprise anybody to know that so many Hollywood critics have, in fact, unleashed their rage against this movie, because not only they didn't like it, but this movie went against their values, and either they didn't understand it, or they took it as an affront to their own personal values. And this is a very interesting aspect of this movie as a cultural event. This is why I've collected only a couple of examples of negative Hollywood critics reviews that I've taken from the Rotten Tomatoes website that is giving this movie 30% as positive reviews out of the Hollywood critics, while 95 or 96% in terms of the audience. You can see when there is this disparity between the critics rating and the audience rating, it means that there is some kind of problem. The two groups seem to have seen something different, right? So here are some Hollywood critics' comments about this movie, and I'm not going to name the critics, only parts of their reviews. Nefarious will appeal primarily to people who think that everyone should have extremely conservative lifestyles and values, because that type of propaganda is what is being pushed in this boring movie with a holier-than-thou attitude. So, wow, these are pretty stark words, right? And you can see how this particular reviewer took it from the political point of view. He says, or she says, everyone should have extremely conservative lifestyles and values, as if the movie was making political statements, while the statements that I've seen, the messages that I've seen coming out of the movie are purely Christian messages that are, by the way, fully in line with Christian and Catholic theology. But automatically, if you're not familiar with that type of theology, then you are going to think about politics. Okay, here is another reviewer saying, if you like your demons on the preachy side, then you may enjoy Nefarious. The rest of us will find Cary Solomon and Chuck Konzelman's evangelical diatribe in devil's clothing tedious, heavy-handed, and indoctrinating. Okay, another very negative review. But here, let's just stop for a second and consider how this adjective, indoctrinating, is being used to describe as a Christian movie. Do you think that any of the many movies that come out every year that are pushing with a very heavy hand an LGBT agenda would be described by any Hollywood critic as indoctrinating? Even if they are, obviously, they will never be described as such. So I think here we are putting the finger on a very, very sensitive button of our culture and of our society. And here is another review. The film's bogus message tells us that Hollywood is immoral because it acts to corrupt its viewers' minds. its inflammatory message is ridiculous, making me highly suspicious of these filmmakers. So this reviewer is using the word bogus message, implying that the movie makers, the movie producers, were not genuine. They were fake in expressing the messages and expressing the statements they wanted to express with this movie. Can you see how there is a pattern here? And can you see there is a pattern why all these Hollywood reviewers, again, either did not understand it or took it personally? But wait, there is more. Here is another review. A chaplain is introduced and abruptly dismissed, and hot-button far-right issues are trotted out in their marching order. Abortion, capital punishment, death with dignity stripped of any euphemistic sugarcoating. This is a very problematic paragraph, yeah? First of all, because we have Christian religious topics like abortion, capital punishment, and euthanasia, called here death with dignity, defined as far-right issues, not even Republican or right issues, no, far-right issues. As I said, I've never felt like Christianity belongs to one or the other political side of the spectrum. But apparently, for many mainstream Hollywood reviewers, it does, far-right. And the second problematic part of this review is where he says death with dignity. By using the positive term for euthanasia, you are already automatically taking sides, as if something moral has been already decided with your language. And yet another review that says, Nefarious becomes blatant propaganda. And that's exactly what the filmmakers wanted to be. If they had attempted to be sneaky about their intentions throughout, the duo might have accidentally made a fairly decent movie on its own terms. So it's blatant propaganda. This reminds us of the previous reviewer who said that it's an indoctrinating movie. Okay, so when it comes to destroying the traditional family in movies, or any type of other far-left ideology presented in today's movies, that is not indoctrination and that is not propaganda. Those words are never used for that. But when it comes to Christian values being represented in movies, that absolutely falls under blatant propaganda and it falls under indoctrination. I'm not making a statement here, I'm trying to orient myself, I'm trying to navigate this culture. Also, not being American myself, being Italian, I am trying to understand what is happening. And as you can imagine, almost invariably every Christian or Catholic outlet and every Christian viewer or audience gave this movie, including myself, gave this movie a stellar review. We love the movie not only because of the message, but also because of the way it's done and produced. And it's acted as well. It's a really great acting performance, especially by Flannery, the actor Patrick Flannery. So in conclusion, I would say this is one of those movies that will make you think, of course, no matter who you are, but within the Christian world, it makes us more alert of evil, of the forms that evil can take around the world, everywhere and inside of ourselves as well. So there is a usefulness for faithful people and for Christians. It's an alarm bell. And it's also a critique of our society. Maybe I would say with a slight insular tone, because it seems from some parts of the dialogue that the movie thinks only about America versus the whole world. But that's a detail. Overall, it's a movie that I would recommend to anybody, even though, as I said, it kind of slows down and peters out a little bit towards the end. But the movie itself is written very, very well and acted very well. And let's consider and let's try to meditate and pray on the reasons why people who have absorbed the mainstream culture of Hollywood in particular, but in general, the mainstream culture, secular culture that we live in, feel compelled to give this angry and scathing reviews to this particular movie. So that's all I had to say, and thank you so much for listening. God bless you all. Bye.